she asked me to share today is how crisis leadership and communication responsibility all intersect, and to offer the opportunity for each of us to bring ourselves forward. And so the three themes we're really going to try and touch on here in the plainest of English are: what does a crisis do to us? How should we communicate? And how do we bring our best selves forward right now? So before we kick off, Sean, I want to go to you for some notes on how this is really going to work. Sean, could you come in with that, please?
Sure. So just a couple of thoughts, if you're new to Zoom, especially. First, we have nearly 800 registrants. So thank you everyone for taking the time. If there are any technical issues with that number of attendees, please just bear with us. Second, we encourage you to submit questions during the webinar. I will be monitoring the Q&A feed throughout, and our hope is that you will participate and sort of help shape the content as we guide you through it. We'll be starting with a few audience questions that were sent in advance, as well as taking pauses throughout the session for you to think and absorb and type your responses. So for the first few minutes, just lean back and listen. If you're not familiar with Zoom, I want to direct your attention to the icons at the bottom of the window. So if you have a question, you can submit them by clicking the Q&A icon. Next to that is the chat feature. So we'll use that to get responses when we want to ask the audience questions. So for example, Kanina might prompt you to reply with a word or a thought. So just stay tuned for that and use the chat function to respond. For anyone watching the stream live on YouTube, you can also feel free to use the chat there to submit your questions. So again, thank you for joining us, and I'll pass things back to you, Mark.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Sean. So let's get going. Kanina, over to you. I believe you wanted to start by answering a question that actually came in yesterday from one of participants that's on today.
Absolutely. Let me first start off by saying this is an honor and privilege to actually engage with all of you. Even though I have arguably the virtual stage here, the reality is this is about us. And one of the learnings that I've had throughout my career is that when we get our minds together, when we come together, we can not only bring our best selves forward, but we can help others do the same. And that's what today is about. We are part of the Ivey family, and that makes me very proud because we can take this time at a time when there are people who are desperately wondering about where the next paycheck is going to come from, how they're going to take care of their families, their health, their safety. We have the opportunity to take a step back and think about how we can be better, how we can help our organizations be better through a time of crisis. And let's think about what the word crisis brings about. The word catastrophe, calamity, turning point, crossroad, critical point, all those words create emotion. And I really want to start there with this idea that while today we're going to talk about a lot of the things that are still the same and how important it is to focus on those, there are some things that really change when we're dealing with a crisis. And the first thing that changes is our emotion and how we feel. So I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm going to ask you to use the chat function to tell me when I say the word crisis, when I say the word conflict, if I use the word challenge, what emotions do you feel? What emotions do you see others feeling, saying, behaving? So please type in those words because we're going to come back to those throughout our session today. So I'm going to share a quote, and this is a quote from Mahatma Gandhi when he said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." And maybe that's a place that we can start, that in our own ways, in our own roles, we're leading, we're managing, we're trying through this crisis to make things better in whatever small way we can. It seems lofty to even quote someone like Gandhi, but perhaps if we start with this idea of what is our purpose, what are we trying to do, I think that we'll find that a lot of our answers are going to come from three key words. One is purpose. The other is vulnerability. In a crisis, we have this tendency to glorify superheroes. But even in the best of times, superheroes burn out. In a crisis, being vulnerable as a leader appropriately means recognizing that it's going to take a lot of us coming together to make change. And the third word that I want to focus on today is the word character. And I will talk about and share a little bit about the amazing work that the Ivey Leadership Institute does on character, just to frame that a lot of what we're talking about here today is not just, it is experiential, but it is also grounded on research. So with that, I want to start with a question that we actually got from you. I'm going to read the first one and try to see if I can help kick this off. And then Mark, you might want to share a couple of other questions, and then we'll go back and forth between some slides, some materials, some resources that you might be able to use, and just having a dialogue.
Yeah,
So
great. Let's do that. I'm also watching the chat window, and there's all kinds of participation. I know Sean's going to work up the word cloud, but we've got a lot of feedback coming in from the audience as well.
Perfect. And that's what we want. We want to hear from you today. So here's a question. I've seen some pretty good and terrible examples of communicating in crisis, but I've also seen what I can only describe as hesitation to make decisions. I had been told early in my career, make a decision, good or bad, it's better than doing nothing. When I read this question, it took me back to an experience that I had. I used to sleep with a go bag, which basically meant I was on call 24/7. And if there was a chemical incident or an emergency in North America, depending on where it was my job to go and work through it, work with politicians, work through the HR aspects, work through with the firefighters, etc. So one day I got a call 2 a.m. in the morning, grabbed my go bag. We'd had a terrible fire and explosion in one of our facilities where some of our employees were devastatingly injured. Let's just leave it at that. When we landed and got to the site, what our emergency responder realized was there was still a live nitrogen line ongoing at that facility. And I have truly seen heroism of that nature, not mine, but other people's, to actually make things better in a very physical way. But there's other ways that we can contribute. And on a management level, I saw exactly what you're talking about, this inability to make decisions. Amazing leaders that literally become catatonic in the moment because it is so overwhelming. When it's your employees, when it is your friends, when it is people who are your neighbors that are being affected by a crisis, whether it's something as dramatic as an explosion or something that we can't even see, a microcosm, a virus, a bacteria, people can shut down. And that way of shutting down is very personal. I saw people shut down. And in the moment, I remember feeling, what the heck? Why are you reacting this way? But I think that one of the first lessons of crisis is to realize some of the words that you're sharing on the chat. You're using words like anxiety and fear, feeling stuck, the fact that everything is ambiguous. Everyone reacts differently in these situations. And so where to start the discussion, what I would say is, as an individual, going back to what you know about yourself, your own social style, your own communication style, the way you tend to react in different situations, you need to know yourself. And as the best way you can to know the other, know your employees, know your boss, know your own corporate culture, because what was before this crisis still is. I'm a driver expressive. My natural tendency in a crisis is to shoot forward and try to find solutions. and to try to communicate. If you're working with people who are highly analytical in a crisis, stress, anxiety, fear, feeling overwhelmed, they're likely to retrench even more in themselves. Understanding other people in the best of times and in the worst of times is where we need to start, because who we are is going to manifest in a crisis. And then we have our context. We have our corporate culture. If you're working in a culture which is very expressive and communicative, you can sort of imagine how that's going to start to look in your organization. If you're an organization that shuts down and doesn't talk about failure or is concerned about talking about difficult subjects, well, you're probably going to start with that place of being shut down. So we need to understand our own context before we address in a crisis what we're going to do. So let's start with understanding. Let's start with caring. And I use the word vulnerable. When we're dealing in a crisis and people are shutting down, they're afraid of making decisions. It's important as a leader to be able to say, this is all new to me too. And I don't necessarily know what the right thing is, but let's start with what we agree on that we want to accomplish. And that brings us back to the idea of purpose. What is your purpose? I have spoken with my own clients in the last few weeks, with my students who are working in organizations, and some of them say, well, my organization is saying all the right things, but I don't believe them because of how they're acting and what they're privileging. This is purpose. If you know your purpose, what you say, how you say it, the consistency of your actions will support your words. But if your purpose is disconnected from what you're saying, remember, people can sense that. Most people are pretty perceptive. And in a crisis, truly, I think the worst thing is to create this division between what is said and what is being meant. And the importance of our communication, the importance of our leadership really comes to the fore. Those are a few places to start. From my journalism background, I know that if I talk for more than about 3 minutes, you've all disconnected mentally. So I think this is an opportunity to stop. I'm going to pitch it back to Mark to give me some sense and maybe continue the dialogue and look for your comments and questions as we go forward. Mark?
Yeah, I think this is a really good opportunity to bridge into that first theme that you talked about. You know, what does a crisis do to us, which you've already unlocked some of that. Just a couple of questions that have already come in through the chat. I wondered if we could maybe take one of those right now, and
Sure.
you could use that as a bridge, if that's okay.
Perfect.
So the first one comes from Donna Richardson. My experience with communication has been leaders cascading messages without context. What tips do you have for leaders to make the communication relevant to various audiences? So maybe we could unpack that in two ways. To answer that question directly, I'll read it back if you want, but I think the starting point on that is, do leaders, do they start to behave differently in terms of chain of command and cascading messages versus a sort of standard scenario?
Okay. So leaders, whether we like it or not, in our own capacities, we're still human. And so as human beings, this idea of knowing who you are and other people are is important, because you're likely going to react in a way that is most natural to you. So people who tend to like to tell others what to do, telling isn't bad. There are times we need to tell people. I've worked with Texas sharpshooters when we had someone holding a grenade on a cooling tower. You know, you talk in a way that's different because that's what that moment expects of you. But you're going to go back to some of those natural tendencies. So start with, how are you communicating as a leader? The next thing is, I'd love to elevate the discussion to say, cascading is a natural way for us to communicate through organizations. But in a crisis, best practice would be for the organization, whatever that looks like. You may be in a very large organization or a small one, but getting people on board, it's never more important to have buy-in on the message, on the tone, on what we're trying to accomplish, on the purpose. So if your senior leader is simply sharing an email, which you then cascade, what I'd encourage you to do, recognizing that this is not always possible, but best practice, see if you can get together as a leadership team and talk through what is the purpose of this communication? Who do we need to be as leaders to have our employees, our suppliers, our stakeholders really believe and understand the message? And that might mean, quite honestly, it's a version of the same message, but it's delivered in a way that works with our different employees. It's different when we're talking to a 20-year-old than a 60-year-old. It's different if we're talking to someone who's in a unionized position and people who are not. We need to focus on context, and you'll use that word, Mark, and it's really important. So come together, decide on the purpose and the general message. Consider who your audiences are and who the best messenger is, and how that tone and approach needs to be customized. And consistency. If it's simply a cascading, that's not going to be seen or felt as authentic. There is very few things as devastating as in a crisis, a leader says, I have no idea what's going on, just do what they say. If a leader themselves is not vested in the approach, that's going to come across. It may not be in your words, but there's a lot of research and science around the fact that people don't really just judge by the words, and they don't remember the words. What they remember is how you made them feel. And so I want to encourage everyone to remember that a message is not just the words on paper or the words that come out of your mouth. They're your paralinguistics. It's your tone. It's your pitch. It's, do you come across with your voice and your body language and your demeanor that you're there for your people? You're there with commitment to the message. Start up top, bring it down in a way that's authentic and true. I hope that helps or addresses some of that question, Mark.
Yeah, I think this question was certainly hinting at in times like these, more context better than less context. Even more important to provide context as the message propagates through the organization. Agree or disagree with that view?
So absolutely. I think that in times of crisis, there's two things happening, right? The demand and the want for information is accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
But having been through many different situations, for example, environmental incidents where you still don't know from the plant exactly what happened. The media wants to know, your people want to know, but the fact is you may actually not know. So in that vacuum, my best advice is know that if you don't fill that vacuum with something, other people will. And my experience is usually what other people will fill is usually worse than what you can share. You have to be strategic. You can't in a crisis share rumor or conjecture. But even if it's to say, here's what we know, and our plan to communicate is this: at noon, at 4, there's some commitment to come back with what we know. And if the answer is we actually don't have some of these decisions still made, but here is our plan, you are filling a void. Please fill the void. And we can absolutely, that's contextual, but that's also letting people know where authoritative information is coming from. That can really help at least keep people focused.
I want to come back to Sean. Sean, how are we doing with the word cloud, the summary, the curation of what came in through the chat? I thought I saw a couple of themes emerge. If you've got something ready, I'd love to see it. You're still muted, Sean.
Absolutely. So these are the main themes, the words weighted by frequency. So we'll take a look at how you're feeling.
I did think I saw a couple of more positive themes in the chat window as I was just looking at it. I saw opportunity. I I saw openness, I saw leadership, I saw innovation, but clearly those were overwhelmed in terms of volume by some of these themes. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Seeing a lot of uncertainty, a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, some compound answers, people feeling anxiety, but opportunity, anxiety, but uncertainty. So, I mean, I think people are feeling a lot of things right now.
Just one note for the audience. So obviously a ton of interaction in the chat window, and there's already more questions coming in through the Q&A that we could possibly get to. If we only did Q&A, I'm gonna think really hard about whether we can schedule a follow-up with Kanina. Kanina, I won't hold you to that on the spot right now, but we'll work with you to see if we can get a follow-up scheduled, because the demand here is just it's a bit overwhelming in terms of what people want to get to. Maybe Kanina, can I bridge back to you? Maybe we can go to your second theme, which is, how do we communicate during a crisis now that we've sort of taken stock of where we are?
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, I'm always happy to help the Ivey community in any way I can. And I know that we've got such a tremendous group of faculty who can bring their own expertise to the table. So look forward to that. I want to bridge this conversation a little bit, is that I want you to take a moment, and if you're looking at the word cloud right now, these are the words that you're bringing from your heart, from what you see. And I want you to think about how you handle these emotions. And one of the techniques that I learned in my experience in crisis management is that self-reflection is absolutely critical. When we face things like anxiety and confusion and fear and panic, even excitement. Excitement is also a feeling that happens when we're in the middle of the crisis, depending on who we are. We need to understand from our lived experience how we've reacted to these situations in the past, and taking some time to think about that. So I'm going to encourage you, those of you on the phone, to try to make this as interactive as possible. You can share on the chat if you wish, or take that crazy thing called a pencil and a piece of paper that some of us still use, and take a moment and think about a moment or moments where you have truly felt these emotions. Because once you can start to identify, it was at this time, it was at that moment, I was with these people, you can start to unpack for yourself what your patterns are, what your approach is going to be. And not that past behavior is necessarily a complete mirror for what we're going to do in today's situation, but it can absolutely help. So in my lived experience, like perhaps some of you on this call, 9/11 was a real moment in time. I was at one of the largest petrochemical facilities in the world, which is one of the largest risks. And planes going into buildings are horrific. But imagine the consequences of a chemical facility, of pipelines, of water purification facilities going down. We were going into a lockdown. We were going into shutdown. And when you shut down facilities, there's a lot at risk. And you've got people who are scared and afraid. Keeping them motivated is so important. Communicating with them, letting them know what's happening so that they don't have to worry and they can focus is something that's helpful. There was the anthrax scare, worked on various situations with activists, etc. So when I go back in time and I think about what have I done well, and quite honestly, what I haven't done well. And like you, I am not perfect. And there are many things that I can go back and see a pattern of behavior where I've done things that did not end up or did not have the outcome that I wish it would have. If we can't look back and look at our successes as well as our failures, leading in crisis moving forward is going to be even harder. So that's a place to start when we look at these words. And then you can again look at the people you're working with and understand what they need. Some people truly want to be left and to focus on their tasks, and they don't want the big picture. Other people can't function without the big picture. So writing down and taking the time to understand what do others need is really, really important. Let me then shift.
One theme that's running through I'm just looking at the Q&A. A theme that's running through here is we have a number of folks that are with larger organizations, large employee bases, and some of the questions are kind of around the theme: is a command and control structure better? Is the CEO or the leader, is visible leadership important, or is it more important to delegate? And sort of how to manage a large employee base strictly from a communication standpoint. I don't know if you could. That probably is sort of in the realm of where you want to go next anyway. And either in your research or from your experience in the field, are there very sort of practical tips and tricks you could share with the audience on this point?
So absolutely. And I would say that it depends very much on your industry, your market, who you are. So I made a comment about the kind of industry that I've spent my time in. So environmental remediation, in government, as well as in organizations. There are moments in time where command and control is appropriate. However, you need to be careful in terms of the approach that you take. Measuring those approaches for the topics are important. So for example, there may be a mandate around safety or health where an absolute, these are the rules and this is coming on high, it's from the board, is appropriate. But take the time in your management team, as we talked about before. This cannot be done in isolation. In managing crisis, one of the best things organizations can do, if you already don't have a crisis management team, one that you've been using to plan and prepare and hopefully practice, which most large organizations will be doing, in which case you have a core group of diverse people representing your organization to give feedback. In the moment, see if you can pull that together. And what I mean is, of course, you're going to have the CEO, your business vice presidents, you're going to have your head of HR, you're going to have lawyers involved. But who represents the base of your employees, the base of your customers? You need to have voices so that you get honest feedback about what their needs are. And where it's appropriate, involve them. Power is a huge issue in crisis. And I want to just point on this because there's several things going on in many organizations that really revolve around power. When we, in a crisis, one of the things that happens is we lose our own power. We don't know what our jobs are going to be. We don't know what we're supposed to do from minute to minute. We're feeling fear. We're feeling anxiety. We're not sure what to do. And as we lose control, one of the things that happens is we become uber focused on, well, fixating on small things. When I worked in Europe, there was a joke, and I don't know that it's funny, but it's telling. And that is that if you get a group of CEOs together in the Netherlands and ask them to work in a period of crisis to come up with their plans for next year, they're going to spend 8 hours on the color of their bike shed. So some of you might laugh, some of you might be saying, why is that funny? It's because it doesn't matter who we are. As we lose control and the world gets crazier, we fixate on small things. I have to keep my kitchen clean, and I am uber perfectionist with my presentations for some reason. Who knows, right? So you see that withering away. And as people lose the sense that they can control anything, one of the things we can do as leaders and leadership teams is where we can give it back, give people the opportunity to have a say on things that have some flexibility. So not on safety, it might not be on protective issues or health issues, but there might be other things that you can give your own team some control to manage. So pull together this large management team if you don't have it. Have voices that truly represent the people, not yay-sayers, not people that are going to tell you what you want, but people who are going to actually keep you in touch with how your suppliers, how your stakeholders are feeling. And think about the things that you must drive down versus the things that you can allow people to have ownership of, because that builds some resiliency. It keeps people purposeful. And it also shows some of your vulnerability and willingness to work as a collaborative team through crisis. And that is so empowering.
Is a consistent set of voices important? If you empower 3 or 4 or 5 folks with specific names, is it important that those folks continue to be the spokespeople during the crisis and as things play out?
Again, I think it depends very much on the topic. So for example, if you have a VP of sales, it might make sense for that person to be the voice of your customers. That doesn't mean that your CEO may not have some strategic messages that they're delivering, but it's the person who is the best giver of that information, most connected, that's important. And we would practice something in a lot of our crisis management teams is when we would come together as leaders, we would quite honestly sometimes fight it out. I mean, you have to have very honest and sometimes they're very tough conversations. What are the key messages? What are the objectives? Who's going to say what? But when you leave that crisis management group, when you leave that team, ensuring and holding everyone accountable for sharing the same tone and the meaning and the message is absolutely critical. The words may change depending on your target audience, but there has to be alignment because that's where we go back to this consistency. If one group of your employees is hearing something different, if your customers are now telling your salespeople that they heard a different message, it unravels, and we don't want that to happen.
I know we're more than halfway through here. You've got another whole section you want to get into, which is how to bring our best selves forward. But before we go to there, Sean, just you been monitoring things. Are there some more kind of technical questions about how to communicate that you're seeing come through here?
Absolutely. I think one of the more upvoted questions was around larger scale organizations. Leaders are experimenting with new ways of reaching large groups of people remotely. Do you have any sort of tactical advice for that?
Absolutely. And most of my lived experience is with large organizations, although in my consulting capacity, I work more with medium and small companies. And there are differences. And one of the biggest differences is the intimacy through which we know our people. Many of us in large organizations have managed perhaps even hundreds of people across geography and time zones, across cultures. And again, I just want to start there to say, remember that if that's your lived experience, even if you're working with people from parts of Canada or across North America, remember their contexts are different, their cultures are different. So be very mindful that a one size fits all may not work. However, if you've got hundreds of people, you can't necessarily do what you can in a smaller, medium-sized organization. So here are some key things to think about. One is make yourself available. Now, that doesn't mean to throw your calendar open because you will burn out if you do that. But make times available that are dedicated to perhaps groups or teams or geographies. And if you work across time zones, one of the things I found when I worked in Europe and had responsibility for the globe is, yeah, sometimes it was you that had to stay up at midnight to connect with another time zone. Share that burden. It goes such a long way. In my working, I always found that people in the Asia Pacific were always willing to work and literally at all hours. And we got so used to that that we forgot that they came in at work at 9, but they were meeting with us at midnight. So that's something small, but that's an example of being purposeful where you want to connect with people and you want to be there for them. Being vulnerable means doing at a time that you're up at midnight or at 5 a.m. Think about what that does to share the message that we want to go through this together. Another thing is what we're doing here today. Technology is brilliant in many, many ways, and it's allowing us to do what we're doing now. But there are some things with technology we need to be mindful of. There's research that shows that there is literally a difference. There is a change when we put our focus on this little aperture right there. I'm going to give you an example. I hope those of you who are watching, and whether this is a good or a bad thing, I don't know, I hope you feel like I'm looking right at you. If you feel that way, that's because I am spending my time staring at a little hole on a camera. If I actually want to look at you, I'm looking here. But as I look here, I'm looking down. And many of you, especially those of you who have sensitivity around these kinds of situations, you now feel like I'm looking down at you. It is so important to try to be at eye level when we're speaking to the camera. It's also important to remember that this technology, while it's brilliant, I'll use the term, it sucks the life out of you. Our own biometrics change. So for example, our rate of eye blinking is not natural. If you're on calls for a long time, you're going to find your eyes are drying and you might be getting headaches. So I'm not kidding. Look what I have here. That says Advil, because I know that's going to happen. Some best practices, like if you're meeting with your team and it's been 45 minutes, say, look to the side. Let's do our recalibrate our eyes to the left, to the right. Why not tell our staff members, guys, I know you're working in this environment and there's lots of good, but I bet your back is hurting because mine is. Let's get up and do a stretch. What's wrong with that? What's wrong with living our values? Again, some of these little things, acknowledging that the technology is creating a difference. I have my water here with me. We don't swallow normally when we're on a video conference. That makes our mouths dry, our lips dry, we cough, we don't feel well because the technology changes a lot of things that are natural. So those are a few very quick things. I could go on for hours with lots of different things that we can do, but those are some important first steps to think about.
I want to do one more technical question. It's quite specific, but I think a lot of people are probably thinking something along these lines. We'll do that, and then we'll keep rolling into the next section. So this question comes from Chris Foca. I apologize if I mangled your last name, Chris. My organization is preparing for our first virtual town hall starting tomorrow. We're thinking about 2 or maybe 3 a week. We're thinking about a time frame, 30 to 40 minutes. Is it okay to roll over unanswered questions in the next town hall? So just some direction on how to hold virtual town halls. I assume Chris has a relatively large organization here.
Absolutely. So one, I applaud you. That's awesome that you're moving in that direction. A few ideas for you. So when we talk about purpose, what I hope you've had the opportunity to do, we can quickly knee jerk and say, here's an email from the CEO, or we're going to do a town hall, or we're going to do team meetings. And the effort is good, but it goes back to our purpose. So every communications vehicle or medium has a different value or purpose. We could argue that Twitter or tweets may or may not be appropriate for policies or for major company directions around safety and health. Maybe in some organizations that does work. So again, context matters. Town halls are wonderful, but they're not good for all things. So I would start with, what is it that you want to accomplish in that town hall? So town halls, for example, could be high-level messages, consistency of high-level messages, showing leadership to the broader organization. So go through what your purpose is, and then decide what the content, the timing is. One of the things that I found most effective is that if you're doing your town hall for the reasons that I suggested, and I'm only guessing at that, so work with me in this analogy, then the issue is that to follow up that town hall with something more intimate. So maybe that's where you have some senior leaders doing that bigger picture and making sure everyone's hearing the same thing. Remember, some people are auditory and visual learners. Some people prefer in writing. So follow that up with a written piece. Then if you want to really customize that message to say, what does that mean for our employees in manufacturing? what does that mean for our organization and for our people in sales, etc.? Then it might be a follow-up that certain other leaders, and you can look at that cascade as appropriate. You also can't spend your whole time communicating, but where it matters, take the time to be strategic about your messages, who delivers it, and then what that cascade looks like and feels like. When it gets down to a fairly intimate group, whatever that means, that could be 100 people, it could mean 5 people in your organization. That's where you also need to hear from your managers and your supervisors, because it helps so much in this cascade if people at all levels hear something that's relevant to them. And part of the message of how can everyone, if your organization is one that says we have leadership at all levels, this is an opportunity to show it. This is an opportunity to make it happen. And this, I'll end with this, may sound trite or silly at a time where organizations and people are literally fighting for their lives. But I go back to the fact that we're human and we can be socially distanced, but that doesn't mean we need to be socially isolated. So maybe you have someone in your team, in your organization, that's always the first one to plan the picnic or the party or the event. You want that person feeling as engaged in your organization as a vice president. If where they got some of their feeling of influence in your organization was making a difference at that level, you know what, we can use this technology, and organizations are, some of my students are telling me, my clients are telling me, we're looking at ways to have a social coffee time, or to have the opportunity to have a chit chat around the water cooler. You know, use this, if you're using Zoom, you can put the feature and actually put a picture of a water cooler around, and with your team, have a sit down that isn't about the crisis, that isn't about where the fear is, but is about the fact that you're people who work and care about each other. I think that goes a long way in motivation and morale and engagement, which is even more important today than it was 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Okay, great. I want to move into the last section. I know you want to talk about how we bring our best selves forward. Sean, is there anything going on that we're not hitting here that we should be addressing?
No, I think the top 2 open questions are maybe a good bridge into this third theme.
Okay, so why don't I ask you, Sean, what are the questions, and I will customize what I'm saying to hopefully address the questions.
So I think one kind of nice thought is from Seema. I apologize if I mispronounced your name. Do we have some ideas, or do you have some ideas for how to recognize our employees working so hard to keep the business going?
Okay, awesome. So I think this all fits into this idea of how do we bring our best selves forward. So I'm going to address it, and I'm going to use some materials, and I can share these materials afterwards if it's helpful to the group. But if we think about how do we bring our best selves forward, if we're in person or we're on the video, there's a few things. So one, it's, are we being strategic with our purpose, what we want to communicate, and are we being clear? That has a lot to do with our comfort in writing and speaking, and there's lots of resources to help with that. I mentioned earlier about paralinguistics. That is everything that comes out of our vocal cords that's not a word. And we express so much through our paralinguistics. The other part is our physical demeanor, what we do, how we act. Now, in the virtual world, let me give you an example of something that, again, seems very tactical but important. If you're talking to an employee or someone who is struggling financially or with health issues, imagine I'm you. You're the person struggling, and I choose to address you from way back here. I can't go any further because I'm connected to my computer. If I stay far back, if the lighting in my room is dark, Even subtle things like that are part of this idea of physical presence. Now, that might not be something we would worry about if we were meeting in person. But if this is someone who you know appreciates intimacy in terms of caring, someone who would like a hand on their shoulder, then you need to think about, how do we bring that forward? How do we show that when there is this camera in front of us? So it's complexity for sure. But if you think about it yourself, you can absolutely ensure that you're bringing your best self forward. Let's think about employees who are working like crazy. I am hearing more and more from people that they are working harder and longer, not less. They're getting up at 7, rolling out of bed and starting to work virtually, and they're not stopping until 9 o'clock. And they're like, where did my day go? Instead of thinking that they would have more time to go to the gym while the gyms are closed, or work out at home, people are feeling even more stressed because they feel tethered to this thing that is the computer. How do we bring our best self? Yeah. So I think I did 11 hours yesterday. But what can we do? Well, let's go back to purpose and vulnerability for a minute, as well as dimensions of our character. If what our purpose is to work people to the bone and to make this a sprint and have people burn out, then you do nothing. If you want this to be a marathon, if you recognize, look, we've sprinted for a week or two now, and now we have to go into a marathon that might be several more weeks, or heavens, maybe even longer, how do you recalibrate your expectations? So for example, where's that phone of mine? One of the things that I had an employee once tell me, which was hard to hear but was true, is, Kanina, you're texting me at 3 in the morning. I didn't want them to do anything at 3 in the morning, but that was sort of the equilibrium I was on, working in different geographies. When something came to my mind, I'd type it out and I'd send it. That small message that an employee had said to me, boy, there are times I'm like, oh my God, I have to write this down. I still do it sometimes, but I've learned to try to take a step back and say, hold on, put a timestamp on this, send this out at 7 in the morning or whatever. Think about this. What about you showing some vulnerability and saying, I don't know about you guys, but my eyes hurt and I need a break? Why don't we plan between some period of time? You may not be able to afford a 1-hour lunch break where you give people time, but maybe it is break time. And you yourself say, I am offline at this period. You will not get anything from me because I am going to be spending time with my child for an hour. I will be back online at this time. Make it okay for people to run the marathon. Telling them won't work. You yourself have to lead by example. Otherwise, they're going to take your approach to be the expected approach. And I don't think any of us on this call want to burn people out. And I don't think any of us want to burn out ourselves. So how do we show feedback and thanks? Do for them. Think about where they're at. Think about the little things you can do and institute to help them make this a marathon that they will feel successful when they complete. Not one that they are angry with you, are angry with the organization, and are disappointed with themselves. That's not the purpose you want.
I know we've talked about that even in here a lot. I think, at some point in the future, what people are going to remember is how they were treated more so than what actually happened. Just conscious of time here. We only have a few minutes left. So first, a commitment to our audience. Again, we've a ton of, actually, just looking at the chat, a ton of great advice and expertise coming in, not just questions. We'll try to summarize and spin that back by email to everybody that registered. Also, we can't possibly get to all the questions in the Q&A. I'm going to try and get to 2 more before we close off, but we will either respond to all the questions that we didn't get to in writing, and or schedule a follow-up with Kanina, which will be much more just addressing questions from the audience. We'll maybe do both of those things. So Let's, Kanina, if you could, we'll do two more and then we'll wrap it up. So the first one comes from Nico. Hi, Kanina. I imagine a lot of us on this webinar are communicators, possibly had issues management or crisis communications for our organizations. In a time like this, as most organizations like mine start to wind down in support of physical distancing, there was a comment here about using the term physical distancing instead of social distancing, which I thought was really great. Where does that leave us? Once we've communicated our closure or continuity of operations, what's next? How do we find personal purpose in a crisis when your current professional position isn't really in a role to help you and feel a desire to contribute the skills that you have?
Wow, that's a
heavy,
really
right?
meaningful question. It's a great question. I love the point about physical distancing. So a couple of things. One, I truly believe that great leaders are great communicators and are great teachers. And in the end, our roles are to do all of those. And in any job, there will be peaks and there will be valleys and there will be different things to do. From a communication standpoint, I say your job begins when you've communicated the basic message of work from home and be safe and do these things. Now the challenge of leadership and of communication starts. In fact, the last question you read to me speaks to that. How do we keep our employees motivated? How do we show gratitude? We know that some people look for financial gratitude, but we know also that most people respond most to some kind of honest, authentic thanks. So if you're in a communications role or a leadership role, and that technical part of your job has ended, maybe it's an opportunity to help your employees, educate them, teach them on how to use the technology better. It's amazing the fear that people have of actually making a mistake online because it's being recorded. You know what? Show your vulnerability and say, I'm afraid too. Let me help you learn what I have. We can communicate and lead by helping others work in this new environment. Even what we were talking about in terms of physical exhaustion or how do we stay connected. Our roles as communicators, as leaders, as educators can shift to how do we engage in this environment in a more constructive way? How about creating forums where if we are working across time zones, for example, as someone who's been an expat on many occasions, it was so helpful to have people teach us about cultural norms or differences or how to read people's body languages working across cultures. Maybe that's something we can build some communication on and help people understand that now you might not even be seeing people, you might just be on the phone. What are some best practices in terms of communication that is going to help your organization sustain? So start with your purpose. We all have purpose in organizations, and we are so blessed, and the fact that we're here means we can make it better. So what can you make better? Once you've done those basics, what additional value can you bring? Because once you also show that, what are you saying to other people? Wow, I know this, maybe I can add value with this. Let's create network. Let's create alliances with people that can help in this new environment. Those are just a few ideas, and I'll definitely think about more and happy to text or communicate some other ideas with you.
Great. Last one. Stephen wants to know what the significance of the violin is on your wall.
Oh dear. So one of the things I say is your backdrop matters a lot. So I am now going to just open myself up. When I ask my children, how do you think my students and people will think of this? They suggested it looked a little bit like grandma's retirement home. So I hope that it's not too boring. The violin, quite honestly, one of my sons wanted to learn the violin when he was young, when we lived in Switzerland, and that violin has traveled with us for many years. I have moved my family wall of shame from here to in front of me, but this is a little remnant that keeps me in touch with wonderful memories. And thank you for asking. I hope
That's great.
that's a good answer.
We're up against it here. I want to be very respectful of everyone's time. Sean, what have we missed here? Anything we should be doing as we wrap up?
No, I think obviously we have some back questions that we will either schedule a follow-up on or cover via email. I was just really pleased with the participation in the chat. As someone who
Fantastic.
doesn't habitually use social media, this was a bit of a reminder to me to actually use technology to just talk to people. Elizabeth's suggestion about saying physical distancing instead of social distancing, I'm taking that one forward. I also saw another suggestion to take your phone and FaceTime during a walk with your manager. So really just some good suggestions, and really happy we did this.
Kanina, thank you so much for taking the time. Thanks to everyone who joined us today, and look for follow-up communication from us on this and on other topics. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you all.